All right. So, hi everyone. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today for this webinar. We're going to talk about adapting IT-CMF. You're very welcome. My name is Anna Brown. I'm up there in the video window. Here's a picture of me as well. I'm a Research Fellow Community Manager at the Innovation Value Institute. Also joining me is Sinead Murnan, who's Research Fellow Community Manager here at IVI also. And last but not least, our guest of honour, Matt Craig. He's just joined SDLC Partners. He was formerly a key player in organisational improvement at BNY Mellon. He'll be sharing some of his experience in that arena today. So a pretty simple agenda for today's webinar. I'll briefly outline our development plans for the first 10 minutes or so. We'll run a quick poll to see what level of experience we're dealing with. Sinead and I will then pepper Matt with questions, if we can get a word in, when he takes us through his experience with IT-CMF, discussing the parts that were useful and usable out of the box, and drilling down into the adaptations necessary for success at BNY Mellon. With a quick poll to see what ideas might be worth getting further focus on. We'll then open up the floor to your questions, comments, and hopefully with a lively and engaged discussion that we can all learn from. Okay. So, a little bit on our background for those of you who haven't joined us before. We are the Innovation Value Institute. We're a technical centre that's part of Maynooth University. Our main product is the framework designed to deliver business value from IT investments. That framework is called IT Capability Maturity Framework. You'll see it referred to as IT-CMF. Because we describe capability maturity at 5 different levels within that framework, we can conduct assessments and help organisations to improve maturity. So here at IVI, we're demonstrating our commitment to ensuring that our core body of knowledge, the IT Capability Maturity Framework, continues to evolve. We need to stay relevant to the needs of our users, so we are adapting and responding to the challenges of the digital era. With that in mind, we moved to a quarterly release this year, which sees IT-CMF updated iteratively. These updates reflect both changes in the industry, the latest academic thought leadership, and most importantly, feedback from the IVI community and users. This means that we continue to help IT and business leaders and managers meet the challenges of the digital age. So we had a spring release in January, a summer release in April, an autumn release in July, and we released our winter release last week in October. So a little bit about each of the releases, just to see, so you can kind of get a sense of the scope of IT-CMF and what kind of things we have been able to update. So our spring release included sourcing and supplier management, information security management, project management, program management, and project portfolio management. And if any of these are of interest to you, we probably have videos on most of these already on YouTube. In the summer, we released 5 more CCs: benefits assessment and realization, knowledge management, risk management, solutions delivery, and technical infrastructure management. So a little bit about assessments. Our body of knowledge allows us to create simple and easy to run assessments that help organizations in their improvement journey. So all the CCs mentioned today come with an assessment, but in addition, we've created some that focus on a wider set of problems. So the release in the summer, the DevOps assessment, provides a focused analysis of an organization's DevOps maturity and identifies the key relevant IT-CMF critical capabilities to aid improvement. The cybersecurity effectiveness assessment provides a holistic analysis of an organization's cybersecurity approaches and identifies key organizational behaviors and technology adoption trends to improve the management of cybersecurity threats. We've also had an IT effectiveness assessment, which maybe you'll see in Matt's slides as it'll be a slightly different name, but it was updated with content from the spring and summer releases. It was updated again with the winter release at the end of this month, and that gives a very broad picture, snapshot of what the capability is across the organization. And Matt will talk a bit about that in his section. So moving on to the autumn release, we had 5 CCs once again: personal data protection, enterprise architecture management, and service provisioning were updated. We previously had a CC called ITG, leadership and governance. Based on industry feedback, we divided it into 2 separate CCs, so one for leadership, one for governance, which I think was in keeping very much with feedback from Matt and his team at BNY Mellon. So now we have those CCs as well. So now getting into our winter release, which happened last week. A little bit more about that and a little bit more detail about that. So just to talk a bit about the background, the speed, magnitude, and lack of predictability of change has ensured that change is becoming an increasingly important capability for contemporary organizations. This is especially true for IT-enabled change in the digital world. There's an imperative both to adapt to market changes, well as to integrate and potentially benefit from ongoing technological innovation. So we have created a new CC called Organizational Change Management, which addresses the ability to plan for and support people, technology, processes and organizations through IT-related change. So we're pretty happy about that. We hope people will find that useful. Getting into the more data area, real-time analytics is becoming increasingly important to enable organizations to make full use of their own and external data to support better understanding, informed decision-making, and to assist planning. These outcomes in turn can lead to smarter business strategies, more efficient operations, higher profits, and happier customers. Our new data analytics CC will allow organizations to develop their ability to specify objectives for data analytics, identify data sets relevant to those objectives, apply analytical methods and techniques, and interpret, communicate, and exploit the analytical results so that value is created for the organization, its partners, and customers. Okay, so that's our 2 new CCs for this most recent release. We also updated 7 CCs. So there was 5 financial CCs that were updated. Those were accounting and allocation, budget management, budget oversight and performance analysis, funding and financing, and total cost of ownership. And there's a more coherent standard approach in these capabilities in line with the other CCs that were updated earlier this year. Finally, the EIM, Enterprise Information Management CC, has been updated in line with the changes to data analytics. They're kind of, I suppose, sister CCs, so they work well together. And then innovation management has been merged with research, development, and engineering to form a new IMCC. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Matt, but I'm going to start with the poll to see where people are in relation to this, and then Matt will share his screen, the background of that, and we can hear from him.
Okay. We'll do that then.
Very good. So we've had some voting. So we've got some news, some exposure. So I'll just end that poll and pull it out of the way.
So I think, for us to approach this session, we can assume we have people of varying levels of experience with the framework. So I'm just going to go ahead and, provide some of the basics of what we've done with it and kind of go from there. So with that, maybe just a little bit of an introduction. As you say, Anna, thank you very much for your intro. Up until recently, I was working for about 10 years actually at BNY Mellon as the head of the Performance and Value Management Group, really trying to drive a lot of insight and change to create more value out of our IT organization. I very recently had the pleasure of joining SDLC Partners here in Pittsburgh, a consulting and development firm that is dedicated to customer success through excellent talent. I've met and worked already with some great people by investing in effective processes and really investing in leadership. So a lot of those things really embed a lot of the essence of what we saw as very workable and essential to success with the work I was doing at BNY Mellon and the work we were doing with the IT-CMF. I was very proud to have joined a company that just last week was awarded the Provider of the Year, the Solution Provider of the Year in Consulting and Services in the region that we're in. So, I thought that was an awesome achievement and just great to be part of this dynamic team. So with that, I think one of the important things to share with people is when we start talking about capability improvement and, all of the aspects of the framework of the IT-CMF or other tools and techniques and so on, it's very natural to say, well, why would I care? What's important about this domain? And so my answer to that has often been to refer back to this study, because I think this captures the essence of why this is an important topic. This was a study run by McKinsey back a few years ago, but I think the principles still hold quite true in the sense of when they looked at organizations who invested in 2 major dimensions of organizational function. They looked at organizations that invested in IT, who basically spent the most relative to their peers on investing in technology. Conversely, who spent the most or invested the most attention and driving maturity for management practices. And then what about the conjunction of those 2 things? So when we look at organizations that invest in technology, they are able to realize a return. So a significant investment in overall technology solutions was able to drive a certain amount of positive enterprise productivity. So it was worth it. Conversely, companies that invested in maturing and making sure their management practices were effective things like lean or change management or project management or strategic management like balanced scorecard, those kinds of domains, they were able to realize a larger return on their productivity as an enterprise, right? So it was worth it for the company to make that investment. But what I find very compelling is when you combine the two and say, well, if we combine the investment in technology and solutions and things like digital or cloud or any of the current technology buzzwords, how do we make sure we can leverage that investment effectively? And really, that's the essence of capability maturity. It is the effective leveraging of other investments you've made, investments in assets, resources, tools and techniques like technology to be able to deliver value for your organization. In other words, to be more productive, to create outcomes that customers care about, clients care about, and that your staff care to deliver. So I find this personally, while it's a very simple slide, a very compelling story. And I'm a great advocate of creating that environment of investing in organizational change, investing in maturity, so that your company can be more successful. And again, as I said, so that your people can work within an environment of positive success and contribution that they can personally make, which I think is fantastic. So with that, and I know we wanted to talk a little bit about, just in summary, some of the key positive attributes of the IT-CMF, the I in general. So
yeah, so you're gonna get started, I suppose, the things that you were able to use as is, and then we'll move on to a bit more detail in terms of the things that you necessarily had to create,
right,
because everybody has to create something to make this stuff work internally. So what you specifically created in BNY Mellon to make it work. So that'll be great. I suppose, what this slide says to me is, I suppose, IT-CMF is at that sweet spot where it looks at both management and IT.
Yep, I think so, and that was certainly our experience as well at BNY Mellon when we made that investment effectively. It worked well to leverage the resources we had in technology. So with that, then I'll move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about three main dimensions of positive attributes of the IT-CMF and aspects of the framework and things like that. So this first slide shares my high-level thinking on what are some of the key elements of the IT-CMF that help it to be beneficial and useful. Some of these elements may be shared with other similar frameworks, but some of them are quite unique to the IT capability maturity framework. So number one, it's very accessible. Now, I will, in case you're curious and you sort of want to zoom in, I have the thumbnails in larger detail if people are interested. So we're going to get to the point of this webinar where people say, hey, I'd like to see more of this. But these are just meant to provide a bit of a visual cue. So the first thing about accessibility around what does maturity look like? When we talk about maturity, what do we mean? And really what we mean is how to describe different points of effectiveness of different capabilities that you have in the organization. The FACTA framework, I think now is 36 critical capabilities, and it spreads a wide range of management practice and enablement in technology and in overall managing how you get your work done. So there's a lot of dimensions to it, but the helpful thing is that it's accessible because you can review these descriptors of like, well, if I was a maturity level 2, I would look like this. I would be realizing these kinds of outcomes as a team or as an organization. And these are typically the kinds of practices I would probably see in my company, or these are the practices I would like to institute. So there's a lot of benefit there to have that clear description. It's not, what would we say? It's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do. It doesn't tell you all the tools and techniques you need to apply, but it paints a picture that you can then use as inspiration to create a similar picture for your organization, using your own methods, using your own resources, the skills of your own people, those kinds of things. So that's a great benefit. The next benefit is this sense of levels of detail for different audiences, different stakeholders. You may be talking to one day the executive committee of the company, and they may be saying, how are you helping technology be more valuable for us? What are you doing to drive technology value creation that creates business performance? Conversely, the next day, you may be talking to someone in charge of risk management or someone in charge of project management or even just a regular project manager. And they may say, hey, what's this framework do for me? Why are we using this? And the good thing is that these different levels of detail can help you respond to those questions. And then the final point is this sense of comprehensive coverage, which I mentioned earlier. And maybe you can see on the little thumbnail, we used a few years ago this slide. We had a bit of fun with it. You can see a little Frankenstein in the middle, where what we meant by that was my team were working on coming up with a solution to cover many domains of management capability and IT practice. And so we were what we called bolting together or trying to create senses of reference between many other domains. And when we were introduced to the ITCMF, we said, hey, that's very helpful because it covers a lot of domains we care about, and it helps to show how they're integrated, which is another positive aspect. So we still used many of these other more detailed domains, which was good, but we did them in conjunction with a point of reference from the ITCMF, which was, again, very helpful.
Great, that's fantastic overview of how ITCMF provides a lot of out-of-the-box.
I'll just skim through a couple of other points I wanted to share about positive attributes. So just one of the other things that we found very useful is the assessments. Again, just to sort of touch on this briefly, but I think what we found with the assessments is this ability for us to gain insight in a structured way that was repeatable, so we could sort of review the results year over year and see how things change, see how sentiment changed, see how relative criticality or importance of different types of capabilities changed. So that was very useful. And in fact, for those who aren't familiar with the assessments, just to mention very briefly that the assessment really gathers 4 key parts of information. The first piece is, how mature are we today? What does that look like? What's our current as-is state, if you will? And getting that input from many stakeholders in the organization, business leaders, technology subject matter experts. So that's helpful. We also ask them, where should we be? Where are we trying to go towards? We then ask, in which of these are the most important for change or investment today? Where should we apply our focus to create the best difference to our company being better at creating value for our clients and our team? And finally, of course, the gathering of insight in terms of their specific comments on challenges they face, recommendations or improvement suggestions they're making, and those kinds of things. And that comes together and is distilled down in the assessment, so we can share that overall input from the company with the decision makers who are going to choose where do we invest, how do we drive change. And so that's very helpful. And then just the final thing I want to sort of mention about a positive attribute was this sense of community that we get out of the Innovation Value Institute. A very engaged community, both outside of things like the IVI summits, and certainly at the IVI summits, having opportunities to engage with other practitioners who are moving along this road of driving organizational change and maturity, having the opportunity to engage in working groups. Like I had a great experience working with colleagues on benefits assessment and realization, and updating that capability standard in the framework. And then, of course, using that kind of principle to build internal communities of excellence so that the stakeholders and constituents and specialists within our organization could come together, even if they worked in different teams or different lines of business, and share their own thoughts around how do we advance good practice for the domains they cared about. So the project managers would be able, had a platform and a system to come together to advance the way we manage projects, and much the same for our risk managers or our sourcing and supply management team, for our sustainability teams, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of benefits there.
So great. So let's move on to that.
Sure.
And let's hear about. I suppose so. This is what people.
So I have 6 key points to share on this topic of adaptation. And these are really just examples of what we did to adapt. I think the primary message here is this sense of you do need to adapt the framework and kind of embrace it and make it your own to make best use of it. So the first example I wanted to share was this need to invest in the leaders and the teams who are going to drive change. Now, we've had a question around, does this only relate to a large enterprise, a large global enterprise? The answer is no. You may only invest in a single leader and a small team who's part-time to help drive investment in maturity. But you still need to make that investment. You need to make the decision. And the nature of that investment takes many forms, but some of the things that are important are that you have to gain buy-in. Buy-in by your business, right? This is not about technology. This is about business enablement. This is about value creation for your organization. And so they need to be involved. They need to be aware. They need to be at least nominal sponsors in concept, if not in funding. You then need to make sure you've invested in ownership of the domains you care about. If you're going to drive change, then somebody has to own what you're changing. If that's indistinct, then you're going to have trouble making it stick. You're going to have trouble gaining the buy-in and the skills and the adaptation needed and the sort of the use of new practices by the people who are supposed to be improving that domain. Now, in domains where it's fairly clear-cut, like again, project management is a fairly clear-cut domain with clear roles and responsibilities, it's a little easier. In some domains, like say knowledge management can be a little harder to grapple with in terms of ownership and subject matter experts, because all of us these days, or at least in my industry, are knowledge workers and all have a role to play in knowledge management practices. But saying who owns it, who's supposed to support and push that forward, can be a more difficult proposition. So you need to handle that. You need to provide people with training on the framework, make sure they have training on their own domain, right? They should be true specialists or at least experienced practitioners with an underpinning of good training and skill in the domain you're trying to influence. And then finally, of course, support around these topics of how do we do organizational change, how do we approach it, what's our method, how do we see whether things are working or not. There are many things like that that are important. The next point I wanted to share that when we started using the framework, we certainly started by investing in training and getting comfortable with the framework itself. And what the training helped us with was an understanding of what is the framework and how can we use it to run assessments to understand our maturity and potential opportunities for improvement. But what the training didn't tell us was what to do next. And so what we did, luckily, maybe not luckily, but myself and members of my team had already had a decent amount of experience in driving organizational change, implementing things like project management standards or service management or other practice areas. And so we had a decent understanding of what it took to create change, to drive improvement. And we realized the ITCMF wasn't going to give us that structure of like, here's how to take and adopt the ITCMF and create change in the organization. So we started building our own improvement toolkit. And the important point about that is it was an evolving reference guide to change for ourselves as a core team, the core team leading the enterprise program to create change across many capabilities, but also a toolkit of reference for those teams, and with a very explicit expectation and repeated support for evolving the toolkit itself. So that was very helpful. Anyone who's familiar with elements of organizational change and the nature of those practices would probably look at the toolkit as it is and was and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Again, back to some of these topics like leadership, topics like cadence, topics like engaging the community of practice that you're trying to work with to create change. Those kinds of things were what was embedded in the toolkit. And the need to see it as an evolution, that it wasn't built and then that was going to be the way it was, but we built a version and said, let's try and use it, and we did, and then we continued to refine it as we went.
Okay, so I suppose then to jump in and recap on this, maybe this echoes some of the things we found when we did that research project with you, is that when people get a chance to use the ITCMF materials, but also to adapt them and to understand them, they internalize the messages much more greatly, and so they're more likely to...
Yeah, that's well said, Anna, and now you stole my thunder on the IPP, which is coming up. But no, that's good. And it moves us towards questions for the audience faster anyway. But no, that's exactly the point. Is people need to own it. It needs to be part of who they are and what they do and what they care about, not a third-party thing that's forced upon them, for sure. So the next one that we had done as an adaptation was that we found the macro capabilities in the ITCMF to be generally useful, but not a perfect fit. Not that we created a perfect fit, but we created what we found to be a better fit to a service-based organization. We created these frames of reference, and what I mean by that is the macro capabilities in the ITCMF house, there are 4 macro capabilities, and they house all of the critical capabilities in a certain way, with a certain understanding of why group them in that way. And it's good, it's useful, but we found that by reshaping those groupings, and we went from 4 domains, 4 macro capabilities, if you will, into what we called 6 frames of reference. the core of that, the thing worth mentioning is because we were a service organization, we're providing financial services to many constituents around the world, we wanted to make sure the essence of service excellence was embedded in the heart of these frames of reference. So that was the number one frame of reference, was deliver excellent service on a daily basis through our people with our systems to our clients. And we then wrapped that single frame of reference with 5 others to create a reference system, still all the ITCMF, just reshuffled, if you will, to make more sense to us around, how do we drive change? How do we invest in continual improvement? How do we enable and support all of this work, all of the other capabilities? How do we lead towards valuable outcomes? So those were some of the frames of reference, in summary, that we developed and found them to be quite useful. And again, I think this expresses that essence of what I said earlier around you've got to take it and make it your own. And that was kind of an element of what we did. We took the good elements that were in the framework and just moved them around a little bit, which made more sense to us. And that, again, developed more buy-in for our team, because they could then look at those different frames and say, oh, I see where I fit. This makes a more natural fit for me and what I do. And the other thing it did for us was we found it made sense to then look at the other capabilities in that frame of reference. Like, for instance, strategic execution was all about going from strategic goal setting, which was sort of an input to that, all the way through to actual delivery of solutions that enabled strategic goals. So including project management, portfolio management, things like that. So that set of capabilities is a natural fit together. And so therefore those teams could work together around common solutions to some of those challenges.
So if I had to recap that, I suppose I would be thinking about the fact that ITCMF is quite generic, and what you're doing there is you're aligning it with your strategic goals as an organization, figuring out the things that are very important to you before you even get into the point of doing assessments and so forth. And it's a way of communicating to the
teams.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think too that the aspect of coordination, and we'll talk about that next around our improvement program structure, but those frames of reference did also help us coordinate the ongoing work of many teams. So it was good in that sense as well. So with that, I will move on to the sort of the next adaptation that we made, which was, it relates back to the improvement toolkit. But the improvement toolkit, at least for me conceptually, is like it's an asset. It's a set of tools and techniques and a knowledge base and sort of recommendations for action and so on. So the toolkit is more like something you could lift off the shelf. The improvement program was really the instantiation of the people and the process and the cadence of driving improvement and the expectations of what are people delivering, how are they communicating, what's the frequency of updates, how are we involving technology leaders, how are we involving business leaders. So the program was the, gosh, there's probably another better word, but it was sort of the living, breathing way that we transformed, the way that we enabled change using the ITCMF as one of our frames of reference or one of our bodies of knowledge in conjunction with others. So, the key elements of the program included that we did have a core team that I led that supported the program, that ran it as a program, but we were a bit careful about that, because one of the things that we said, and our CIO certainly reinforced and said this himself, was this isn't about a short-term program. This is about creating change in the DNA of the organization to be always invested in ongoing change and improvement, always invested in seeking ways to create more value. So what we were trying to do was really basically run this as an ongoing service, but to a certain extent we still called it a program because we had to stand it up and structure it and get things moving. But it certainly was a multi-year initiative that did deliver good outcomes and increases in maturity and business benefits and many different types of business benefit as a result. So those elements of the program structure, the way we did reporting, the way we did communication with different stakeholders, the way we supported teams through coaching and other kinds of calls, all of that, the continuing investment in the improvement toolkit was all part of the program.
Okay, so the message I'm getting here is that you can't just say, let's go, let's improve. You have to actually put something in place on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis to support that.
Yeah, absolutely, Anna. It needs to be an embedded part of the way the organization operates. So program, as I said, may not be the best name, but investing in a an ongoing stimulus for organizational improvement that also tests, is it really occurring, as opposed to is activity just happening, right? Are we getting the results is really, yep. So the next one, you mentioned it, the IPP, our Innovation Partnership Program, this engagement where myself and Anna and a number of others came together in a joint partnership research undertaking to basically ask these questions, to be very simplistic about it. We had been involved with using the IT-CMF and driving organizational change by that point for at least maybe 2 or 3 years. And we knew what we were experiencing, and we were having good success, but we were also having challenges. And IVI wanted to learn, how do we help other organizations, including BNY Mellon, adopt and leverage the IT-CMF, or even more broadly from an academic perspective, what are the inhibitors to change? What are the drivers of change? What should you do about it? And so it was a very successful research project. It was good working with Anna and members of the research team to answer these questions and sort of come up with, on the one hand, some ratification of what we already believed to be the case around things like engaging people and making them own their change and things like that, but also helping us to modify some of our approaches, in some cases simplifying some of the toolkit to actually even help other people who are involved with us, particularly people who were not within the core of the way BNY Mellon operated. There are a lot of people in New York and New Jersey and in Pittsburgh, and so people outside of that geographic realm maybe felt a little bit at the periphery. So engaging some of them through the research and giving them opportunities to build elements of their own toolkit to drive their own change was a very successful thing that we did. So again, maybe not something that everyone would consider, let's engage in academic research, but we found it to be a very helpful adjunct to our overall change journey.
Without even putting the academic part in, it's always good to stand back and look from an outsider point of view, what's going well, what could be better, where can it be improved. So I suppose if the other 4 things, you have to have them. This one, possibly a nice to have, but if you're not actually thinking about, because it's the external part that's the nice to have, you would absolutely have to be saying to yourselves why, what's working, what's not working, and what we need to change, do differently in that kind of agile way. We have a few questions that come up on this slide.
Why don't I'll wrap, because my last point, Anna, is really just an element of,
I think you addressed
the others, and then we can totally go through all questions. This last one, I'll admit I just added this one in last night. But I realized that I hadn't really, I think I mentioned this in the previous session, but the other element of this, and you can say it relates to the improvement toolkit, it's very valid, is we came up with what we called, we never came up with a better name, but we called it our what works list. But it was these characteristics of what is essential, right? What do you need to have in play for the change and the improvement and the value realization to be effective? And I tried to very much summarize what we had on our what works list into these 4 points. You've got to be committed, right? You've got to focus. You can't try and do everything at once. You've got to adopt, right? You've got to, and what we mean by adopt is you've got to take on board what you're trying to do, both in terms of improvement, but also in terms of, we're talking here about changing behaviors. We're talking about changing organizational habits and practices. If you're not seeing that occur, then you're not doing anything. And then the final thing is this adaptation, which we've talked about some of the examples here today, which again is speaking to make it your own and learn and adjust as you go. This sort of sense of empirical adaptation and change of whatever it is you're trying to do. So you need to realize that you will need to adapt. You'll need to adapt yourselves and your team, but you also need to adapt what you're using to make it fit what you need it to do. And so that's kind of it for my high-level examples of some of the adaptations we made. So let's jump into the questions.
Okay, and I suppose if I was to look at this last point, the 6th one, I mean, there's a lot of that, the commitment is echoed in the investing in leaders and teams. The focus would be in the improvement program. The adoption and adaptation would be in the toolkit and the frames of reference. So, there's certainly, you're pulling those out as being important. Let me go back to the first question, and I think you answered some of this about the working in a small organization.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, one of the things I've always said about the framework, I've sort of challenged some people where they say there's too much, right? There's too much in it. It's too many capabilities, too much information for me to handle. And I get that, right? There is a lot of stuff in the framework. But what I've sort of come back with is, well, you tell me what you don't need, right? Which of the various capabilities in the framework is irrelevant to you, is irrelevant to the way your organization operates? And I've yet to find anyone give me a good answer to sort of say, yeah, we can exclude this. Now, that just sort of sets the backdrop of the framework is generally relevant to any business, whether it's a large one or a small one. However, if you don't have the resources, and small ones certainly don't, even large ones really don't either, have the resources to pay attention to all of those capabilities and deal with them and change them and update them and make them more mature. So what you have to do, back to what we were saying about focus, you've got to understand what is it that's relevant to you today? Where are you trying to go? And a lot of this, to me at least, is predicated on an understanding of what are your strategic drivers and challenges, and what's the best way to address them. And probably one thing I'd mention about that when we first got into this is we tried to balance the need to respond to relatively urgent issues of maturity and sort of put in place improvements to some domains that would pay off quickly. So that was necessary. So think about that. What might you be struggling with in terms of maturity of some element of a capability that really needs to be fixed, in the near term? But conversely, sometimes the nature of those kinds of fixes doesn't necessarily lead or give you a foundation to longer term value creation, right? And what I mean by that often is, short-term things like, let's fix the way we manage incidents, right? Okay, fine, you can do that. But if you keep experiencing lots of incidents, managing them better can only take you so far. What you probably need to do is move upstream of that and invest in your design practices, your project management practices, maybe even upstream of that of your strategic goal setting and what you choose to pay attention to, and maybe or portfolio management, and reduce the number of items you have in your portfolio so that you can focus on getting things done well. I mean, those are just some examples, but what I'm trying to say is, for any sized organization, think about it in terms of time horizons of what you need to change, and then focus your investment on what you can influence as best you can based on the resources available. But anybody, any individual, any team, any company can make that choice. And there's another choice, which is to not choose and to ignore this domain, in which case you'll kind of be status quo and someone's going to outcompete you, because there are organizations that do pay attention to this and they do invest in this. And as I said, that slide at the beginning around the productivity of the organization, their ability to serve market and client needs, the companies that do this well outcompete the companies that don't. So you can't really, or ignore it at your peril, I would say.
Okay. Right, very good. So the next question is, what sort of practical things do you think will really demonstrate
that's a
great buy-in and support for such change?
So some of the things we did, just a few examples. Our CIO did engage a number of times with our board of directors. So this became an initiative that had visibility and support from the board of a global enterprise, Fortune 150, I think, that BNY Mellon. It's a big company. So having board level support, which therefore implies and was true, executive team support of the business, is one example of management buy-in. Another example, perhaps a little closer to home and more tangible, was I was able to engage members of our executive committee to help present at the conferences that we hosted for IVI. And they were involved with, what were we doing and what results was this driving for the organization. We had our chief of staff talk about expectations for overall organizational improvement and the relationship between those high-level executive expectations for the company as a whole and how that related to what we were doing in technology with leveraging the IT-CMF and driving capability excellence. So those are a couple of examples. So I would say, the big picture version of that is there communication occurring that you can point to? The other thing would be to make sure that the relationship between any kind of change program like this has a sort of an explicitly defined relationship to the measures of success for the organization. This ability to say, well, strategically, what are the critical success factors and outcomes we're trying to achieve? And in what way are we going to ensure that the results of these efforts, whether we're trying to improve the way we manage projects or manage risk or manage finances or people or any other things you can do by leveraging the IT-CMF, how will that drive organizational success, and how will we show that that's occurring? So that's another thing to keep in mind. And if you can do that, and particularly one of the, I think, good ways to address that is don't pretend you know. Engage with your organization's leaders and ask them, what do you think? Right? If you say we'd like to increase the engagement of our employees, we might like to increase the skills of our employees, we might need to update that skill set to move into the modern era and modify the way we work, whatever that might be, you can then work with them to say, well, what might that look like? How would we know we're being successful? And then when we say, for instance, look at people management or some of the other practices that relate to people and learning and growth and development, what is it we're going to do to influence those outcomes that senior leaders care about?
Okay, maybe I could just back that up with, you've talked very much about the high level, and it's really important, but I think looking at what you're doing at the periphery and at the low levels is also important. So communication, I mean, I suppose communicating it both through emails and through company things, but anything, you know, posters, and that's especially important when you're not dealing with the people who are at the center of what's happening. And making sure that people can access the training and the resources no matter where they are in the organization.
Yeah, those are good points, Anna.
Get their backs behind it. Would have been my experience there. Maybe, yeah, to move on to Alex's question. So Alex says, adopt and adapt. Interested to learn more about managed frame of
Hang on, let me
do you have
let me
that
go
on the
pull
slide
that up.
maybe that you could share, or
it's buried in my 49 slides here somewhere. All right, here we go for Alex. So I'll give you the quick skim through this. And again, I kind of outlined it earlier. You can see on the left now, when we built this, so there's some slight tweaks obviously to the structure of the framework now. You know, leadership's separate from governance, but we could still reset those. So don't worry about the fact that the CC references are slightly stale. Doesn't really matter. So the first thing that we did with this is we had a mission statement, if you will. You can see that on the right for BNY Mellon, the global provider of choice for investment management. And investment services, recognized for broad and deep capability, superior client service, and consistent outperformance. So that's kind of our mission statement for the organization. It was important to put that in there to say what this is, this investment in the IT-CMF is sort of improving capabilities of IT. It's, again, not about IT. It is about enabling the realization of this mission statement for the enterprise, right? So then we said, okay, great. So as I said, the core of it is delivering excellent service. And you can kind of ignore the fact the arrow is overlapping both of those sets, but you can see service provisioning and technology infrastructure management, supplier management, and so on. Well, what we embedded in that element of excellent service, what does that look like? The other thing I think is worth sharing is these are not, I mean, while on the diagram, yes, they are delineated, we didn't mean them to be separated. We didn't mean them to be distinct and not related to other domains or other frames. So keep that in mind as well. We saw a lot of interplay between different capabilities. But the next thing we did was we said, look, in order to support this ability to deliver excellent service, you've got to have this underlying foundation for success. You've got to have people, knowledge, enterprise information management, architecture, risk, security, and probably other things, right, that bolster and underpin everything we do. And so that was what we put in for enabling capabilities. And really, we then said a subset of the enablers really is financial management. Manage the finances, the flow of funds and resources financially through the enterprise so that you can support the value-adding activity that the organization does. The next one was how, we can't stay static, right? We can't sit still and just assume everything's fine. We must create what we sort of would call strategic change led by insight into where does the organization need to go and why, what are the challenges it's facing or the opportunities it wants to capitalize on. And so you can see sort of the biggest frame of reference in terms of number of CCs was this one of strategic execution. And the little arrows jumping in there on the animation, if you saw that, was kind of our inference towards projects and programs, right? You have discrete initiatives and investments in creating major change, right? And that's what we looked at as strategic execution. But then the next component was we also want the organization to move towards more of a mindset of continual improvement, right? Yes, we're going to always have strategic big play programs, projects, a big portfolio of initiatives we can have a look at a list. But on the other hand, we also want individuals and teams to invest in their own work, in their own excellence, things like the principles we see out of Toyota, Kaizen, ongoing continual improvement. And while those things are very closely related, strategic execution and continual improvement, we felt they were distinct enough to call them out as a separate frame of reference. And again, you can see here capability assessment and management, business process management, research development, innovation, and user training and management are elements that relate back to continual improvement. And then the last one was all of that needs to be informed by being value-centric and strategic. And so with the last frame of reference was this one of value leadership. And again, you can see here strategic planning, benefits assessment, realization. We put ITG there primarily because of the leadership component. Now I would put governance as a separate CC down into an enabling capability. And then relationship asset management is the final one. So hopefully that gives you a basic understanding of what we did with those frames of reference and how we were able to use them in those groups to make sense between capabilities, so people working on those capabilities could work together on them, and then sort of how they fit relative to a service-based organization. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Matt. And it seems like, yeah, that seems like Alex is happy enough with that. There's probably, we can put the poll up, Matt, but it's probably not a lot of time to get into anything in further detail at this point.
If anyone does have any other questions, and we can throw them in the chat, we can run the poll. Why don't we just run the poll? Because we do have a few minutes. We can run the poll, see what people think. I do have, I would say I have no end of slides. I do have an end of slides, but there's a lot of slides and a lot of things to share. And I think, while you get the poll running, Anna, I'll just share a couple of thoughts as we go. I think I said this at the beginning. Yeah, you've got to kind of own this. I think some essential elements, again, to sort of reflect on them. The commitment is so important, right? You can't be an organization that believes that improvement will occur somewhere else, right? Somebody else's problem, if you will, right? You kind of need to make it your problem. And not so much make it your problem, because it's not a problem, but you do need to make it a commitment to carving out the time to create a more excellent organization. That's the other thing. I remember having quite a number of discussions with different people, busy senior leaders and things like that, and they would say, Matt, we love this stuff, we think it's the right thing, it's what we need to do, absolutely, no question. Just not right now, because we're pretty busy right now, so we'll get to it. And I would gently argue that point, and I would continue to argue that point, is there is no better future time. There is no time when you're not going to be very busy. And so you have to make a conscious and proactive decision that you will make time for this kind of work. And not just for some team somewhere in the organization to do this stuff, because that doesn't work either. It does help to have a team of specialists support others, but this needs to be the work of the company. This needs to be the work of the regular employee and manager and leader, that they have a hand to play in creating a better organization, a better way of working, better practices, processes, skilled team members, those kinds of things. I'm not saying that.
Okay, so the vote, well, it was on there a minute ago. We basically, between the first one, what good looks like, many levels, got a third of the votes, and 2/3 of the votes went to building your own communities of practice. If you wanted to do a minute on communities of practice.
Yeah, it is a deep area. I mean, I can jump very briefly to the slide. I think there are a couple of good points to make about communities of practice. Number one, the need to invest in people sharing knowledge, especially at a company like BNY Mellon. We have people everywhere in many businesses. So we created communities of practice to help give them a home to come to share their knowledge and skills about their practice domain. Whether it was, again, project managers or risk managers or whatever it was. So it was good to have that cross-organizational collaboration support with a COE. The other thing we did is, just to use an example, was actually the people who were responsible for our COEs to help stand them up and make them successful used elements of the ITCMF as well as the principles in the ITCMF to create their own custom capability of COE management, right? So they made up an acronym, and we saw a number of examples of this through our adoption of the ITCMF. We're using it as at least a point of reference to help create additional ways of looking at the world of work and looking at maturity characteristics, looking at practices. So that was helpful in and of itself. So, sort of the support for the community was good and necessary. You need people to have a tribe to come together with, if you will, that they can help work with each other on adopting and adapting and improving the way they work across the organization and even with others outside the organization, right? So industry communities of practice. But I thought it was a good example here that we had a team that also built the method to do this for ourselves based on ITCMF methods and structure. Pretty much.
A whole new webinar in itself, Matt, really, you could do on that. I suppose in a big organization, one thing that had resonance for me when I was working there was that, you know, finding your tribe was a really important part, and it gave people great satisfaction to know that it was tribes, people that
Indeed.
were like them beyond their geographic location. So it's a very good point. Yeah. So I'm just going to take control back from you and bring up the finishing up deck, if that's okay. So just if you'd like to have more information, IVI.ie is our website. Our LinkedIn community is there. You can search for IVI Global Community on LinkedIn and you'll find us. Please join. Community managers, Sinead and I, always happy to get your emails and chat. And if you have partner inquiries, Paul Goddard, also happy to hear from you. We're on Twitter. We're quite active on Twitter. So please follow us there and feel. With only 1 minute to go, just like to thank Matt very much for being our honoured guest at this and for sharing all this perspective. Thank you all for coming to the webinar and taking the time to join us and engaging in the discussion. Some great questions today, so thanks for that.
Well, again, it's been a pleasure, Anna, and everyone that's been on the call. You know, I think it's great to have these opportunities to share our insights. You know, it's been great to do similar kinds of things at the conferences, but, you know, I think this sense of community of IVI is such an important thing to keep fostering. So it's great to get the questions from people, great to stay engaged with all these colleagues from around the world, and, you know, look forward to the ongoing journey.
Yes, great. So thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Alex, for your questions and your comments, and we will say goodbye.